The maid froze, shame flooding her face as dozens of guests looked on. It was not just a correction, it was a deliberate act of humiliation, a performance meant to remind everyone of her power. But this time, something was different. Before the first maid could lower her head in apology, the new maid stepped forward. Calm but unyielding, she positioned herself between the wife and her target, her presence alone defying the unspoken rule that no servant ever confronted their mistress. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Guests leaned forward, astonished by the audacity. The wife's face stiffened, her mask of elegance cracking as fury rose to the surface. The new maid did not shout, nor did she plead. She simply stood, her eyes steady, her silence louder than. The air in the ballroom was heavy, as though the chandelier itself might crash down at any moment. The guests stood frozen, glasses paused mid-air, their eyes darting between the furious wife and the unyielding maid who dared to face her. For years, the billionaire's wife had commanded every room she entered, but in this moment her power flickered. The new maid's calm defiance cracked the perfect image she had so carefully built, leaving whispers to rise like smoke among the wealthy crowd. The wife's voice, sharp and trembling with outrage, tried to slice through the silence. She demanded obedience as she always had. Yet for the first time, her words fell empty. The new maid did not move, did not shrink, did not apologize. Instead, she stood tall, her steady presence declaring what her lips did not need to say, that cruelty would no longer go unchallenged. The first maid, who had endured years of humiliation in silence, felt something stir within her chest. Her trembling hands steadied as she watched the impossible unfold. She had always believed resistance was dangerous, that survival meant quiet obedience. But seeing another stand firm in the very heart of the storm lit a fire she thought she had lost long ago, and then something unexpected happened. A murmur spread through the staff stationed at the edges of the room. Their eyes met one another, then returned to the new maid, who still held her ground without fear. It was as if her courage gave them permission to breathe, to see themselves, not as shadows, but as human beings worthy of respect. Even the guests, glittering in jewels and gowns, felt unease ripple through the evening. They had come to sip champagne and admire luxury, but instead they were witnessing a truth no amount of wealth could hide, the cruelty behind the perfection. The wife's mask began to crack further. Anger turned to desperation as she realized the room was no longer on her side. The silence that once protected her now worked against her, amplifying the image of a woman exposed. In that single stand, the new maid had shifted the mansion's unspoken law. Fear was no longer the master. A seed of change had been planted, and though it was fragile, it was unstoppable. What the wife failed to see was that this was not just defiance, it was a beginning. A chain reaction had started, and soon, the house that once thrived on silence would echo with a voice too powerful to ignore. The gala eventually ended, though the air inside the mansion never returned to ease. Guests left in hurried carriages, whispering about the scene they had witnessed, carrying with them a story that would ripple far beyond the mansion's gates. But within those walls, the true transformation was only beginning. The first maid, long accustomed to lowering her gaze and swallowing her pain, carried the memory of that moment like a lantern in darkness. She had seen someone stand where she, herself, had always bowed, and it awakened something she thought she had lost, her voice. In the days that followed, she moved through her duties with a new steadiness. Her shoulders no longer bent beneath invisible weight, and her silence was no longer born of fear, but of thoughtfulness. The wife noticed, and it unsettled her. Where once the maid trembled, now she seemed unshaken, her obedience no longer blind, but measured. It was during a quiet morning, while polishing the vast dining table, that the shift became undeniable. The wife's commands, once sharp as daggers, now met with calm acknowledgement instead of fear. The maid did not argue, but she also did not cower. She worked with dignity, as though reminding everyone that service was not weakness. The staff saw it too. They began to move differently, drawing courage from the subtle changes around them. The kitchen bustled not just with clattering pans, but with quiet glances of solidarity. What one maid had sparked, another was carrying forward, and soon it was spreading like an unseen fire. For the first maid, the greatest change came within. She no longer looked at herself as invisible. She no longer believed she was powerless. Watching the new maid had given her proof that dignity could survive even in the harshest of places. And now, with her own strength rising, she understood. That silence was not the only way to endure. The mansion was no longer the same prison it had been. It had become a battleground, not of violence, but of dignity against cruelty, of courage against fear. And at its heart stood two women who, without ever planning it, had become the voice of everyone too afraid to speak. The story of the gala traveled faster than anyone expected. What had begun as hushed whispers among the staff was carried into the city by guests who had seen the unthinkable. Behind closed doors, in polished dining rooms and glittering ballrooms, people now spoke not of the wife's beauty or her jewels, but of the scene that had shattered her image, the defiance of a maid in front of high society. The billionaire could not ignore it. His empire relied not only on money, but on reputation, and the cracks in that reputation threatened everything he had built. When he finally returned to the mansion, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. He entered the grand hall with a measured pace, his presence filling the space with a weight heavier than any chandelier. The staff lined the walls, their hands folded, their eyes lowered. Not out of fear, but with the anticipation of a verdict. The wife descended the staircase in her finest gown, her voice laced with urgency as she rushed to explain. She spoke of betrayal, of disobedience, of staff who no longer knew their place. She painted herself as the victim of insolence, twisting the story into one where loyalty had been broken. Her words flowed quickly, desperate to rebuild the power slipping through her fingers. But the husband's eyes shifted from her to the staff who stood silently in the hall. Their faces, though quiet, carried a truth she could not erase. The first maid, weary but no longer broken, stood tall beside the new maid, whose calm defiance had already altered the fate of the household. Together, they were more than servants. They were a mirror to the truth his wife had long tried to conceal, and it was not just the two of them. One by one, the staff straightened their backs, their silence no longer empty but filled with meaning. In their steady gazes was unity, quiet yet undeniable. Yet, they did not need to accuse, nor did they need to speak. The weight of their dignity spoke louder than words. The billionaire, a man who understood power better than most, saw clearly what his wife could not. Authority built on cruelty cannot last. The mansion that once echoed with her commands now pulsed with resistance she could not extinguish. The mansion was quieter now, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was a different kind of silence, a peaceful one, born from dignity reclaimed. The corridors still gleamed, the chandeliers still sparkled, but beneath the surface, everything had changed. The wife, once the unchallenged queen of the household, now found herself a shadow of the power she had been. Her voice, once sharp enough to command obedience, carried no weight. The staff who once trembled at her footsteps no longer feared her presence. Authority built on cruelty had collapsed, and she stood among the ruins of her own making. The first Maid, who had endured years of humiliation, now moved through the halls with a quiet strength. No longer bent beneath invisible chains, she worked with dignity. not as someone broken, but as someone who had survived and risen. Her endurance had been the foundation, but her newfound courage was the victory. Beside her, the new maid remained steadfast, not as a savior, but as a spark. She had not toppled the mansion alone. She had simply lit the fire that proved one voice, even a quiet one, could shift the course of power. Together, the two women had done the impossible. They had turned silence into strength and fear into unity. The rest of the staff followed their lead. They worked as they always had, but their steps carried new purpose. They were no longer invisible. Their presence mattered, and they knew it. Outside the mansion, the story continued to ripple through society. Some dismissed it as scandal, others as gossip, but many whispered it as truth, that even in the grandest of homes, injustice can be unmasked, that wealth may command admiration, but dignity commands respect. And so the tale of two maids, one weary and one unbreakable, lingered as more than a story. It became a reminder, because in every place where cruelty hides behind power, there is always a choice, to stay silent or to stand. And the question remains, not for them, but for us. If you had been in that mansion, would you have bowed your head or lifted it high?